Prochadamus. I remember the day after my ordination, the morning of my first Mass, vesting in the sacristy, putting on the amice, putting on the alb, the cincture, the maniple, the stole, the vestments. I remember the 10 years that I had been preparing for this moment. Aside from the emotions and the nerves, I was aware of what offering the holy sacrifice of the Mass means for myself and for all the faithful. But additionally, given the context of the current persecution of the traditional Catholic faith in the world and in the church. I grabbed my chalice, I grabbed my beretta, looked at the crucifix, bowed, and said, Procedamus in pacem, to which the altar servers replied, In nomine Christi, Amen. I put on my beretta, and we processed out to the altar to offer the holy sacrifice of the Mass, the traditional Latin Mass, the Mass of the ages. Ascending the steps of the altar, I felt only gratitude to our Lord for having allowed me to be an instrument in preserving that which is true, good, and beautiful for future generations, for the ages to come. As long as I'm physically able, this Mass will continue to be offered. This spirit of determination, this spirit of perseverance, is that to which I would love to invite all of you to share. The first annual Prochadamus Gala is organized to support the mission of the Oblates of St. Augustine and the Old Roman Catholic See of Caglou to preserve the traditional Latin Mass and the traditional Catholic faith for future generations. Prochadamus.
Good evening and welcome to one more episode as Father Martin and I go through John Senior's The Restoration of Christian Culture right here. How are you, Father?
Doing well, Alberto. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm excited for this episode. It's going to be we're going to be touching up on a lot of very interesting ideas in today's episode. I do want to remind everybody about the Prochadamus 2026 Gala in Clearwater Beach, Florida. Buck Hall will be joining us as the Master of Ceremonies. Father Calvin Robinson will be joining us as the keynote speaker. Father, you will be there. Bishop Miko will be there. I will be there. And we are very excited. Looking forward to it. And do remember, to those that have logged in, we're still waiting for several of y'all to log in, participate in the chat. You are able to participate on the chat from YouTube. If you're watching on Twitter, you can make the over to YouTube and participate in the chat there, or also drop us a comment over on the Twitter chat. So, Father, today, the restoration of Christian culture. This is always a very, very pertinent title for this book, because just today we saw the Vatican puts, well, I suppose was it yesterday that they put out the one on ecumenism and then the one on monogamy, polygamy. But anyway, so they put out new documents. We were told at the beginning of the pontificate of Prevost that he was going to remove Cardinal Tucho Fernandez, and we are looking at the opposite. They are rolling out magisterial documents like it's no one's business. So this reminds us that really the only way to maintain the integral Catholic faith, meaning the traditional sacraments, the traditional faith, because really the traditional faith, the traditional sacraments, especially the Mass, is a reflection of the Catholic faith. The grifters want us to have one separate from the other. So it really, in some way, Father, they even say, like well-meaning people that go to another sort of as if, whatever. You can have the faith, or you can have the sacraments, or maybe some people can have both, but either which way that you're fine. So this the restoration goes right along the spirit of Prochadamus, as you explained in our introduction. Prochadamus in pace is what the priest says immediately before proceeding over to the altar in the traditional Latin Mass. So this is the spirit. So the title of today's chapter is Theology and Superstition. Let's see. I'm going to read from the first couple of lines here from the chapter, Father, because this really sets up the mood for the rest of the show. It is increasingly difficult for conservatives to converse with liberals and for traditionalists, even with each other. I haven't the credentials to settle these disputes and shall only try to tell my story, for the sympathy it might elicit in some understanding heart, like the coachman in Check Vote Stale, who tries all New Year's Eve to talk to party after party of revelers, and at last, back at the stable, confesses that his son has died to the tired old horse. Superstition is something standing over from a former time which we no longer understand. What are your thoughts on this very last sentence, Father?
It's true, as the saying goes, when the shepherd is struck, the sheep scatter. And so that's kind of what a lot of the conservatives and traditionalists have, constantly been discussing is how much of the new do we accept, if any at all, and how much do we compromise with the new, if any at all. And so, in coming to, well, knowing how he plays out the rest of the book, I mean, the very title, Theology and Superstition, he'll eventually show that the ultimate difference is that theology requires a certain level of understanding, which presupposes that people are formed to be able to understand in the sense of education. Just like, we want our children to go to college, get a good education. It requires elementary, middle, and high school. Well, one of the things that we'll see that John Senior um, rebukes us for, and rebukes our age for, is precisely the fact that none of us are prepared to actually study theology, to even understand theology. So,
Good evening, Amy, Mr. Mark Becker, Diane. Thank you so much for joining us. Excited to have you all back over here on Restless Heart Media. Very thankful that you are tuning in this evening. Remember, if you can leave your questions in the chat, and we will try to get to them before the end of the show. If we get to the end of the show and there are no questions, then we'll just go ahead and finish out the episode. We are going through John Senior's The Restoration of Christian Culture. This chapter, Father, in this chapter, he talks a lot about St. Thomas Aquinas, and it's sort of it really is the foundation, St. Thomas, and the Summa of this precise chapter. As you mentioned, and another big theme in this chapter is that we are not even able to comprehend Saint Thomas. And then he talks about certain strategies that they would use even before the council, which some would say anything before the council is based. Well, he's even going after some of those ideas. Let's see, what question do I have? How do I frame this question that I have? That is, in knowing Father John, did you see some of the similarities in the criticisms that because he was an expert at formation, Father John was.
mm-hmm.
Did you agree with the criticisms regarding the formation in theology that Dr. John Senior makes in this book, as per your conversations and experiences with Father John?
I mean, Father John never really brought them up. I mean, one of the criticisms that John Senior makes in this book is that many of the seminarians didn't study theology through Latin, that they didn't even know Latin well enough in order to study theology and philosophy in Latin. And so that's why eventually Rome had to change to the vernacular, because seminarians were coming in and they didn't even know the language. Actually, this is still somewhat a problem even with vocations coming in, because even vocations that are raised in going to the traditional Latin Mass their whole life, they don't study Latin very well. I mean, homeschool, all that kind of stuff. They maybe have have gotten their feet wet in the language, so to speak. But then they show up, they have a vocation. They show up to a seminary, they show up to a monastery, and they're asked to pray, all 10 hours of the divine office, consistently and tempo with the rest of the monks, with the rest of the seminarians, and it's impossible. And so you can understand a young man being completely frustrated and saying, "I can't do this. This is too difficult." And so in one sense, we even have that situation today. The other situation, I think I'm starting to notice a pattern between those who are professors, who have PhDs, who professors at universities in the humanities, whether it be in I don't know, history, poetry, literature, these kinds of subjects, where they see all of reality through their discipline, And I was actually at a talk recently with Dr. E. Michael Jones, and he basically said, actually no, he explicitly said that the Romance languages, French, Italian, Spanish, they all had philosophers in their language, but the English did not. What the English had were poets, and philosophy in the English language must then be studied through poetry. And so he constantly referenced Milton, Chaucer, and even Shakespeare, other poets that were even influenced the United States American Revolution. Thomas Paine, his little pamphlet. Even the Federalist Papers by Hamilton. So this sorts of things. And so John Senior is very much a poet, and so he very much emphasizes poetry. And he's actually said this already previously in one of the chapters. I don't know if you remember, Alberto, but emphasizing that our language in our country is English, And so we should, in one sense, that we have no need of learning a second language to actually study philosophy through these second languages. Rather, we just need to stick to English. And I think we both criticize this and say, no, I mean, in Europe, everybody knows like 3, 4, 5 languages. Languages aren't an impediment, but Americans somehow are fixated on only one language in life ever really being necessary. And if you want to identify or form a nation, you have to just adapt whatever language you've already been given. So I think that's one of the critiques that I would criticize Johnny Senior for, is that that's never been an issue. Every seminarian for all times has always had to study Latin. He's criticized learning a second language for identity, but now he's emphasizing a second language for the same thing.
Well, but the problem, Father, is that there was and I shared this with you, Nose Order priest, a very old Nose Order priest who was around during the council. He said to me recently, a couple of months ago, he said they had to get rid of Latin because none of the Americans could learn Latin. They were so bad at it. And so John Senior does talk about that precisely also in this chapter. But he says that's why they had to get rid of Latin, because it was embarrassing. It was showing how, and again, these are not my words. This is what this old priest said, because it was showing how stupid the Americans were. They could not learn Latin. And so, and John Senior does get into the difficulties and basically how they would get through not knowing Latin, being able to read a backward or something like that.
And we have to remember too, one thing that's commonly, I guess, not understood or unknown, is that previously in the 1917 Code of Canon Law, Catholic families were required to send their children to Catholic schools. So no public schools and no homeschooling, Catholic schools. But of course, we had saints who founded religious orders, especially in the United States, precisely to provide Catholic education to the poor. I mean, St. Philippine Duchesne, Elizabeth Ann Seton, Mother Cabrini, all these nuns started orders precisely to serve and educate the poor, because there was no other option. Now that we open up the floor, in the sense of now you can send your kids to public school or homeschool now that you want, of course, now we have no need of religious sisters, and so now we have fewer vocations. So
let's see. I am going over to page 74 at the very bottom. It is better, as Socrates repeatedly said, not to know and know you don't, than not to know and think you do. Or as the poet said, no matter how tediously quoted, the lines are true. A little learning is a dangerous thing. Thing. Drink dip or taste not that Pierian spring. Theology and philosophy are difficult, exacting sciences. There are few vocations to such studies in any given generation, and even for those with special gifts of intelligence and will, there are still 12 years of prerequisites in elementary and high school. And of course, this situation in the seminaries constitutes a kind of cream puff for the shrewd students of Boissy and Marichal, some of whom must have perjured themselves in taking the oath against modernism, who got themselves ordained under false pretenses and into positions of power, preparing the way for what Paul VI called the auto-demolition of the church. And so I'm going for a couple more sentences. And so I shall begin on a heavy note. There are always those who say we must cheer each other up despite the truth by urging solutions to what are termed problems. And then a couple of sentences down. I should rather cheer us up with the neat old truth that we are not meant to succeed in this world anyway, but rather to do the job in front of us as best as we can, because our hope is in the next. It's Father, let me ask you this. Why did this, you posted, you advertised our show tonight, and then you quoted this, you added this quote. What about this quote caught your attention?
I think because of actually what he mentions just 2 lines down. He said, there is no possibility in the general loss of Christian culture that we could build a cathedral like Chartres, or write a text like a Summa Theologiae, or even, except for a few, understand him. The whole of Christian culture, the seedbed of scholastic art and science, is depleted. We are in a dust bowl, as the Kansas used to say. And if you plant wheat, though it may sprout up, it will almost instantly wither in a drought. So many of us want to save our institutions. We want to save the buildings. We want to make our pilgrims to the very Cathedral of Chartres and say that we're reestablishing Christian culture. But John Senior says, no, in fact, not. We no longer have the faith that built these cathedrals. Not even those of us who remain have the intellectual understanding of the faith to erect such magnificent edifices, buildings that um, are the fruit of our faith. He's saying, no, we're a remnant now. We're a dust bowl. We have to start back down with the bare bones. And so eventually later on in the chapter, he'll tell you what those bare bones are. He's going to argue for the contemplative life. But in a sense, he's basically trying to pitch to us the idea to sell us on the idea that we're basically in the 300-400s again, in the early church, 300-400s, where there was no real instituted religious life, organized religious life. There was very little organization. Ecclesiastically, the law was run very loosely. There was no code of canon law per se. And it was very, every bishop for himself, so to speak, in the sense that when he needed to communicate with Rome, it was slow. I mean, snail mail. But nevertheless, each bishop was not a middle manager of the Pope's demand expressed immediate wishes, but actually was the high priest in each diocese. So he's painting the picture like we are the early church again, and so we're going to have to take a lot of our restructuring, restoration ideas precisely from the early church.
Yeah, absolutely. You went over the Dust Bowl. And of course, the whole of Christian culture, the seedbed of scholastic art and science, is depleted. St. Thomas called his life's work straw at the end, dying where he started out in a Benedictine cloister. But his was the real, though springy stuff, capable of bearing the kernel and the fruit of sanctity. Neo-Thomism in our own time couldn't even stand up to the grasshoppers of relativism and social Darwinism, nor could the few serious Thomists, such as Garrigou-Lagrange, propose a real theology to those who couldn't see beyond the rhetoric of popular science, which dazzled them with figures of speech in place of the quiet light of thought. Gilson recounts in one of his last set books how he had refused a request from Pope Pius XII to write a refutation of Teilhard de Chardin, whose manuscripts were, despite their condemnation, circulating surreptitiously among the young Jesuits. Refused, Gilson said, out of no disrespect for a beloved pope, but because there was no clear doctrine in Teilhard to refute. This reminds me a lot, Father. We go back to, for example, Vatican II, who he had a lot of influence in that school of thought. And we can see the same thing, Father, even in the writings of the Novus Ordo popes. So they write in a certain way where they know that the conservatives are able to attack them, to go to bat for them. And then they know that they will be able to refute the traditionalist points, even though they are not really refuted, but then they eventually resort to authority, which is an interesting paradox because they reject those teachings. So they say, oh, you are being disobedient to the Vicar of Christ. But even the arguments that they're making is that our Lord is optional. So you don't believe in that, but you're just using the faith as a manipulation technique.
Exactly. This style of poetic writing is very much emphasized or very much used, especially in the Pontificate of John Paul II, where he would say he would use a whole lot of words to say very little. In other words, saying things in very flowery languages, precisely so it could be understood the way the reader wanted it to be understood, and didn't say something explicitly, directly, and clearly. So, I mean, we call it ambiguity, right? But that's exactly what poetry is supposed to be. It's supposed to be, in a way with words, melodic, so that each person can get something different out of it.
Let's see. I lost where I was. That's fine.
In Gilson.
But even Maritain, perhaps the best popularized of Saint. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. But even Maritain, perhaps the best popularizer of St. Thomas, admitted at the end it had been a mistake. A student from the good days at Laval just after the war told me how at the end of a lecture on Aristotle, when someone asked for an easy example, Charles de Koninck simply lifted his outstretched hands in a silent gesture, clearly meaning, you must come up. One has to see the truth of principles, whereas popularizations, even the best, obscure as they explain. So I do not, says John Senior, so I do not advocate anything like a revival of St. Thomas. I think it's impossible under present conditions. And then he's going to go through, Father, through this, as you mentioned, this sort of like step by step. So I won't spoil it. It's a very interesting, but basically saying Father John Senior is making the argument here that Saint Thomas is basically the result of the early church. So we have all these guys that are like lay expert Thomists, but as he just said a couple of paragraphs before, we are depleted. So trying to explain Saint Thomas when we don't even have the very, very basics, when we are back, I would say we're back to apostolic times, but not even then, because we don't even have the faith of the apostles. But as far as I mentioned, the structures, that's where we are at. But then people want to LARP and behave as if, oh, we are just building on St. Thomas. No, it was, the edifice was completely demolished, destroyed. So we have to start at the 300s. We can't start at in the 1200s.
One of my professors in Rome, when I was studying at the Lateran, asked, what is a Thomist exactly? Is a Thomist someone who memorizes Thomas and can just simply regurgitate Thomas? Or is a Thomist someone who thinks like Thomas? And I mean, all of us thought there for a second. It's like, obviously someone who thinks like Thomas, because the person who thinks like Thomas is the one who truly understands Thomas. And so, to your point, Alberto, that's exactly what John Senior was saying, is that Thomas was a fruit. He entered Monte Cassino in the age of 5 or something, went to the University of Naples at the age of 16. He was the fruit of all the hard labor of the Benedictine charism, of a Benedictine monastery, the Benedictine education, the Benedictine spirituality. And so his intellectual understanding of the faith was nurtured by the resuscitation of the divine office, being given the opportunity to live religious life, to spend time in contemplation and study. It was the fruit of the early church that, again, to your point again, Alberto, that gave us Thomas. And so in order for us to come back to that point again, here and now, we have to start to rebuild, not just from the 14th century, but from the 4th century.
Oh, Father, I can't possibly be an Augustinian because I'm like a new Saint Thomas. To your point, Diane, of finding this chapter challenging to understand, I think what helped me, Father, I don't know if you would agree, it's precisely saying it as this precise interpretation which you just talked about. We take it from the point of view that what he's arguing is that at the bottom, at the source, he's arguing that even a revival of St. Thomas is worthless, because we just talked about how last week we talked about, or no, it was a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how he says the restoration of Christian culture has to be the restoration of the convents and of the monasteries. So this is where we start, but we fall into the trap, which I do agree with John Senior on this, Father. We fall into the trap of thinking, oh, I want to restore the church. I'm gonna buy the Summa Theologia and read it and become an expert at this, because this is what's going to restore the church. I disagree with that, but he puts it into a structure that is easy for me to understand of why precisely that doesn't work, even though it had been something that I could tell. Like, it seems so dumb to me when we have this like lay online Thomists, but I couldn't quite put the words into exactly why. So this is what helped me sort of understand the chapter. I want to remind everybody about the Procedamus 2026 Gala, procedamus.com, over here in Father Martin's name badge. Procedamus.com. Buck Hall will be the master of ceremonies. Father Kevin Robinson will be the keynote speaker. Acquire your tickets today. Tickets are going to be running out more and more as we get closer to the date. You want to make sure that you get them. Do not put it off. I'm a phlegmatic, Father, so I always put things off, and then I regret it, even in very important matters, such as the Procedamus Gala. Let's see. I'm on page 77. Let's see. The Christian soul is forced into patience, silent, interior receptivity to nothing but the agency of God. Noisy, shallow, arrogant types, misreading and misleading the times, rush around urging us to action, even to wild public displays of prayer, in a silly show of rash, unfruitful, and destructive activity, like the sailors on the way to Tarsus as Jonas slept in the still dark hold of the pitching ship. The age was symbolized for me when I arrived at a once magnificent Benedictine abbey to deliver a like. Oh, this is a really good story. This is a very. Here we go. I'm going to read the whole story, Father. It's a
Okay.
couple of paragraphs, but I think we'll be fine. The age was symbolized for me when I arrived at a once magnificent Benedictine abbey to deliver a lecture to its seminarians. I would assume this would probably be 99% Novus Ordo Abbey.
Mhm.
At the entrance gate, instead of the porter prescribing in St. Benedict's rule who must greet each stranger as if he were Christ, there was an intercom system with an attached chart of names and numbers to call. After vainly ringing the monk who had invited me to speak, I wandered around the well-appointed grounds until a hard-working layman with a calloused hands, raking gravel on a walk, probably not even a Catholic, certainly not a monk, but an honest man, directed me to a building where he thought there might be lectures. Entering at last, I was greeted by an amiable prior or rector, smiling affably, dressed in his habit to be sure, holding a can of Coca-Cola in one hand and a cigarette in the other. Boccaccio would have enjoyed the scene, but not Saint Benedict or even Chaucer. And then reading this paragraph, let all guests that come be received like Christ, for he will say, I was a stranger and ye took me in. And let fitting honor be shown to all, but especially to churchmen and pilgrims. As soon therefore as a guest is announced, let the superior or some brethren meet him with all charitable service. And first of all, let them pray together and let them unite in the kiss of peace. This kiss of peace shall not be offered until after the prayers have been said, and on account of the delusions of the devil. In the greeting of all guests, whether they be arriving or departing, let the greatest humility be shown. Let the head be bowed and the whole body prostrated on the ground, and so let Christ be worshipped in them, for indeed he is received in their persons. The rage for novelty and informality in everything today is a sure sign of our spiritual emptiness. So, what this made me think, Father, is that we get told, oh, like all of the ritualism and like, for example, what we just read from St. Benedict, all the ritualism means that there is no substance behind it because you're not being spontaneous.
Mhm.
Basically, modernists value spontaneity as the number one aspect of everything. But as we know from the traditional liturgy, it's when the rite is being followed that it allows the mind to actually focus on God. Otherwise, you're thinking of how to make brand new things and how to make it reverent and so on and so forth.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, novelty. Oh, man. I mean, there's also. I mean, it's also it couples together like the throwaway culture. That's. I mean, fun, where happiness, the fulfillment of desire, is reduced to just a good time. So, I mean, fun. If you go into a sporting game, if you're going to a movie, and we'll talk about movies here in the next paragraphs, or something entertainment, concert, you experience some sort of euphoria, something where it gets your emotions high, emotions, you feel good. But these emotions eventually die down. It's for the moment. It's not perpetual. It wasn't made to satisfy that deep, most profound desire in our hearts for a lasting happiness. And so whenever we insert fun into the liturgy, things that just get you an emotional stimulation for a few seconds, a few minutes, what we're saying ultimately, we're reducing religion down to the level of those other entertainment things that only satisfy us for a few moments. Now, the thing is, those of us who are actually profound and looking for the ultimate desire for our happiness are ultimately going to conclude that if the mass is just going to give us fun, like a rock concert or a movie, then the fulfillment of my happiness isn't going to come from here. That's where we're going to conclude. That's what I concluded when I was in high school. And so you begin to look elsewhere for something that's lasting, something that's will actually fulfill our desires. So, yeah, it's yeah.
So in page 79, Father John Sr. went to watch Star Wars.
Yes. Well, at least I'm assuming it's Star Wars. It's pretty close. So can I read that paragraph?
Yeah, I'm already there.
He said, I went to my movie of the year over the holidays just to keep that much at least up with the times, and found something advertised as decent enough for a man my age not to be embarrassed. There ought to be ratings like parents admitted if accompanied by a child. It was a science fiction show which ended with a scene in which an astronaut, apparently a descendant of the notorious man from Racine, copulates with an electronic space probe. The most popular of the current flicks popularizes neo-Manichaeism, an adaptation of the ancient heresy which teaches that God is both good and evil, the Force, the films call him. There is even a hint that the leader of the evil aspect is secretly the father of the young hero of the good, just as, according to the Manichaean myth, Satan is the real father of Christ. So he goes on to say, uh, I have to lunch twice a week at the local Hamburger King. You know, of course, that millions of Americans now regularly eat French fried potatoes with their fingers. We have sunk, anthropologically speaking, beneath the cultural level of the fork. The daily unrecorded habits of a people are measures of its values. A disintegrated civilization shows not only in the low level of the arts, but in its pop entertainment and its lunchbox. So it's true. Is all of our values from novelties to wanting to dress down and wear jeans and t-shirts all the time, to wanting to eat with our fingers, to the pop entertainment that promotes Manichaeism. These sorts of things just show where we're trying to find fulfillment. It's in this degeneracy, relaxation of all things important, etiquette. Um, and so you can then, I mean, it's not too far to, again, go to Walmart and see a certain demographic in their flip-flops and basketball shorts and wife beater tank tops, whatever, or having curls in their hair and putting that huge net over it and just walking out in public like that. These sorts of things. I mean, if you can eat your French fries with your hand, why can't you go to Walmart in your flip-flops?
So if you go to an airport that is outside the United States, like for example, if you're at the Mexico City International Terminal, you can immediately tell who the Americans are. It's actually really funny, and it's true.
Well, in
You-
Italy, you could always tell.
and also what's interesting, Father, is just going like for a walk, even in Italy. It is very different how the average person is dressed than how the average person here in the United States is dressed.
Mhm.
And yeah, we basically are brought up in the way that everything has to be casual. Now, of course, there's a reason for for etiquette, because if you have ever had a meal where everybody's properly following etiquette, everything goes very smoothly. If you ever have had dinner with people that are basically barbarians, it's so weird. Let's see.
And it's so much so too that if you're not casual, then you're snotty. You're judged for being snotty, or being either nose up in the air or stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're shamed for it.
So John Senior says, I'm still hearing oh, this turned off my light. My bad. At least I'm still on, apparently. I need to turn it back on right after finishing speaking. So John Senior says, nothing short of a miracle could produce a great theologian today. Why is this, Father? Let me turn my light back on. You can answer the question.
I mean, basically, he also mentions it a sentence or two before it. I switched page. So I do not advocate a revival of St. Thomas any more than I should advocate building replicas of Mount St. Michael or Chartres. This is not the time of day, to say the least. Basically, our culture has become so degenerate, our education has become so lackluster, that no one has the actual foundation to become a good theologian. Nobody has the prerequisites. Nobody has the skills. Maybe has the talents, but nobody has the formation to do these great things yet. It's like throwing someone into a professional sport without them having played in middle school, high school, having had the proper coaching, these sorts of things. And so all we can do really, literally, is just read books, memorize answers, and spit them out with no real understanding. And again, that's what he's ultimately going to say is superstition. So memorizing St. Thomas and giving quotes of St. Thomas without an understanding of St. Thomas, John Cedar will say that's not a theologian. That's not theology. That's superstition.
And again, this is what all of these men that are like, oh, I'm such and such Thomist, such and such Thomist. What they it's like, this is so dumb. You're basically skipping thing. And then by the way, Father, if we don't have, which I we may have talked about this on Friday, if we don't have like the lay people saying that they're professional Thomists or whatever because they have a YouTube channel, then we have the grifters talking about how monks should live.
And here's the thing about the Thomists is like I don't understand if really his understanding came from his love for God. His understanding came from his love for God, and his love for God helped him to realize that he should leave this world and enter religious life. Why all the plethora of these Thomists that young single men that don't consider religious life something that's viable for them, a legitimate option. It's just a way just to seem more spiritual, I guess, to practice your faith even more intensely, to read St. Thomas and then just spit out answers to be this apologist. But then, yeah, you have lay people telling monks how they should live. They expect every priest to be a desert father. Why are you online? Well, because I'm not a desert monk, and there are such things as different vocations. There are vocations that are meant to live out in the Thebaid in Egypt, eating grasshoppers or whatever. And there are those who are out there supposed to hammer heretics and to put people in their place, lay people in their place when they're trying to tell you to, no, just accept the mass, renounce the faith. But all we need is the mass. No, shut up.
Now, Father, it would be a different thing if this whole idea of priests shouldn't be online. If this was coming from somebody literally living in like Saint John the Baptist in a cave in the desert. Like if somebody like that says that, at least they have the resume, I suppose, to back that up to say that. But no, it's like it's regular lay guys that are online, that are on YouTube. Yeah. So it's an interesting phenomenon. So let's see. I'm on page 80, and he's just basically talking about lamenting the. I suppose he says a fear of thought, a fear that weakened, untrained intellects might be seduced more easily by error than emparadized in the chaste, cold arms of truth. I was talking with Mrs. Flatcath, may have been yesterday morning. We're speaking precisely as we were talking about homeschooling and about just different things. And I told her, I said, because you have the homeschooling curriculums, and not everything in there is going to be precisely correct according to the faith. And so I told her, look, regarding the globe, I said, okay, you can tell her that what we believe as Catholics is that the earth doesn't move, but I have no problem you telling even a 5 or 6 year old, okay, this is what we believe. But there are some people that say that everything around that the world, that the earth is moving all around. So at the end of the day, even scientists, Father, they have tried detecting the movement of the earth. They have found none. So even science admits that it's relative. So anyway, I have no problem teaching to the children, this is what we believe, and this is what other people believe. And in a way, I felt I identified, because even before catching up for today's episode, I was talking about that with Mrs. Flatcath, and I said, yes, it's fine to teach. And then eventually, of course, you have to teach children that, yes, there are people that believe that murdering babies is not a problem.
See, I could be a dessert father. I couldn't be a desert father. Dessert father, give me dessert. I could be a dessert father for sure.
You could be
A hardcore dessert father. Thanks for that one, Mark.
Let's see. All right. So I'm done with page 81. This is basically what he's talking about. Let's see. I don't have anything in page 81. I'm on page 82.
You don't have anything on page 81. You don't have anything on page 81.
No, just flying through.
I like the whole page.
Okay. All right. Tell us about it, Father.
Okay. First big paragraph there. But as their generations waned, bishops and seminary rectors accommodated to an increasing ineptitude in the students, which had resulted from the general collapse of Christian culture in the industrialized world. So they were adapting the education to the degeneracy of the students. The new young men came up from schools after the turn of the century for the first time since the Dark Ages incompetent in Latin to begin with, and in all the liberal arts. Under the immense pressure of economic necessity, the elementary and secondary schools were fast substituting technical studies for the poetry, history, and old fashioned study of science called natural study or natural history, in which Aristotelian philosophy and consequently scholastic theology had grown. I must emphasize the fact, too, because it isn't sufficiently admitted, that all studies at colleges and universities are now technical, even the study of literature, music, and art. This is so true, especially in the United States. We even say, in the Republican Party, the conservative movement is even emphasizing this. When you go to college to get a degree, get something that you can get a job with, get something that will make you money. Education is no longer about the development of the human person, the flourishing of the human person, making a good human being. It's a trade school. It's essentially just become a trade school. You learn a trade. You go to the university to learn a trade, not to become a human being, not to become a human being, but to learn a trade. So that's all college has become, all university has become is a trade school. And so that's what John Cena is arguing is like now all education is geared toward a trade, not toward understanding philosophy or theology, not the liberal arts. Of course, the liberal arts are geared to they're called liberal arts because they're freeing, liberal in action in the real true sense of making you free from your passions, from your vices, to make you live virtuously. That's what these arts were supposed to help you to do. Liberal arts are supposed to help you train your reason to reason correctly and to live virtuously. That's what the liberal arts are supposed to do. Nowadays, people laugh. If you say I have a liberal arts degree, people laugh at it. It's like, ha, that's useless. No, these are actually the subject matters to help you live a virtuous life, to help you be a true good human being. And so the liberal arts are essential to then study philosophy and theology, the theology being the highest of all studies. But now all of elementary and middle school and high schools are geared to trades, college, 2-year schools, trade schools, or even universities, all about getting a trade, getting a degree so you can get a job and so you can go make money. Completely, totally. The whole education system needs to be revamped. And that's why going through school these days is really just, it's not education. It's not education.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So that's sort of, well, what makes me think, Father, is I'm going through our timeline that we've been talking about, Saint Benedict, the 300s, Saint Benedict, Saint Thomas. A lot of us want the high Middle Ages without the spirituality that produced it. As we keep, this is what we keep talking about here on Restless Heart Media. We want the high Middle Ages, the kings and so on and so forth, but we don't want the grunt work of the Saint Benedicts. And so I do hope that this chapter sort of sets us up in a reality. So we have to be back to reality. And the reality is that, as we've been saying from the beginning of the show, everything has been destroyed. We are completely destroyed. And again, very, very consistent with the spirit of this channel of Restless Heart Media, of the Procedamos Gala, is restoring the monastic life. We all think, people always think, Father, oh, I want my son to be a priest. I want my son to be a this or that. Let's arrange our homes. And I say this having young children, and I understand that it's very difficult, but let's arrange our homes in a scenario where it's an easy transition into religious life. An easy transition into religious life, a life of prayer, a life of sacrifice, a life of really being hated by the world, even. Because you get more hate, Father, than say than if you had just gotten married. If you have just gotten married, which, by the way, with the new document from Rome, people should be nicer to you. If people are calling you schismatic for watching Restless Heart Media, you can tell them we are part of the one. What is it? The one
universal Christian creed. The one universal Christian creed. We all profess the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. So,
and so, again, I've mentioned it multiple times. Procedamos.com, the Procedamos 2026 Gala in Clearwater Beach, Florida. Buck Hall will be the master of ceremonies, Father Calvin Robinson. And we're all saying Father Calvin Robinson promoting Procedamos. We're so thankful for that. Buck Hall promoting Procedamos. Prochedamos.com. Acquire your tickets today. Prochedamos 2026 Gala in Clearwater Beach, Florida. Father Martin, you will be there. Bishop Mikkel will be there. I believe Mark Becker, you will be there, sir. Looking forward to that. It's going to be a wonderful, wonderful evening. So let's see. Okay, we're through the boring page 81 where I didn't have anything. On page 82. 20th century seminary professors were commanded to teach St. Thomas to students who simply did not have the prerequisites. So they didn't form, they shaped.
That's a pretty good.
What we need, they thought, is a new synthesis of the Catholic faith in the spirit of the times. What St. Thomas did for Aristotle, we shall do for Marx, Husserl, and Heidegger, who are exciting and alive. Again, we're getting ahead of the ball, even with our understanding of academics, according to Dr. John Senior.
So, I mean, in formation, religious formation, they emphasize the difference between formation and information. So information is just facts, whereas formation is giving you the principles on how to live. And so when you're being formed in religious life, you're not just getting the, memorizing rules, because that rules are information. It's just facts. These are information. But forming you on how to live so that you're actually able to decide in different circumstances when the rules wouldn't necessarily apply, in a black and white instance, on how to live according to the spirit of the rule, the principles. And so this is what's called a formation. And so not having the background of the liberal arts and philosophy, knowing Latin, they didn't have the formation, the ability to comprehend and understand the actual material that they were being taught. All they could do is memorize for the test. I'm sure we've all been there before, where we're cramming for a test, trying to memorize the answers, memorize formulas so that we can show up on test day, take the test, and then we're free. We feel free. The whole load is lifted off our shoulders because now we can forget what we just learned. That's more or less the new attitude of the age.
Page 83, Dr. John Senior talks about industrialized society, and his argument is that, he really backhandedly, I suppose, makes the argument that industrialized society works against the faith with all of the comforts that we have in modern life.
Huh.
So, page. If he was not around when this was not written when children just had iPads to behave at restaurants and all the like. Page 84. There is almost nothing not artificial in his experience. The fibers of his clothes, the surfaces of the tables and desks he rests his elbows on, the food he eats, the air he breathes, the odor even of his fellow inmates reeks with waves of artificially scented deodorant in this space vehicle we have made of Earth.
Yeah, with the industrialized society idea, we have. I think he'll draw this out later on when he returns back to his theme of the monastic life. But the monks, because they prayed so much, had time to concern themselves when they were working with their hands for their food and their shelter, and that was about it. But now, when we don't pray, all of our time is spent working on trying to create something to sell for somebody else's convenience and for their entertainment pleasure. And so I think that's what he's ultimately getting at is now we're living not for God, but for temporal pleasures, technology, and creating all these pleasures, the latest iPad, the latest iPod, the latest, iPhone or whatever else, creating these unnecessary conveniences, as opposed to praying and then just focusing on the necessities.
On page 85, he says, and yet there are those who want to do it their way, meaning theology, differently, expanding their minds in a waste of shame, trying as it were to reinvent the will. And then he makes a great point. He says, the main lines of Catholic truth are all in the Summa Theologiae, and it cannot be done again. If anyone were to do it, which is impossible today given the loss of the culture that went into it, but even if it could be done, it would turn out to be the same. So there it stands, as vast, incomprehensible, and stupefying as St. Michael and Charles. Superstition, standing over, as I started out to say, is the precise opposite of understanding. And for large numbers of Catholics today, not only the theology of St. Thomas, but the faith itself has become a superstition. We give assent without belief because belief supposes some degree of understanding. Faith, like science, without intelligence is magic. Many, most under a certain age, at Mass now have little understanding of the greatest act in the universe, before which the angels bend their knees. With the loss of culture and the help of liturgists, most Catholics see it now primarily as a way of sharing the presence of Christ in each other, especially through a parody of the Benedictine kiss of peace. And I think this even extends to the trad world even today. So it's really just like a social event for a lot of people.
No, absolutely.
Which I've said to you before, Father. When one gets accustomed to going to daily mass, to me, Sunday mass is like, it feels like a chore. I just go like, I literally just go because it's an obligation, but like so many people and whatever. Meanwhile, daily mass is just actually quiet. Actually, people that need to be there are there, not like. And I've gotten in trouble in the past for saying LARPing, taking taking all your babies or whatever, so that you can show off that you are a real trad that has a lot of children, because that's really the only requirement. Having a lot of children, not having good ones, but having a lot is like is the crown jewel of being trad. So, and honestly, superstitious, because people have said, "Oh, I want to be in the presence of Christ." You can be in the presence of Christ in your house. So people have this superstition that you can be in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament, and even if your interior disposition is literally nothing, because understandably so, you're taking care of a baby, walking in and out of church, and so on and so forth, you probably would have a better disposition to be in the presence of God at home in quiet than at a church where you're trying to keep your little ones quiet. So anyway, but we have to sprinkle a little bit of superstition there, that just by virtue of you being like inside the church, that you're getting some like Gnostic graces that you could not possibly get by being even more devoutly in the presence of God at home in actual silence and not distracting yourself and everybody around. That's superstition. And he gives a story about a priest that he knew, and basically the children said that he says he has the children where Christ is truly present, and then the children's overwhelmingly said in the community. And then some said afterward they thought the choices should have included the book of readings which the priest or lector always celebrates at Mass as if it were the host. To give another example, there have been scandals of intercommunion, as it is called, in which priests have deliberately distributed the Blessed Sacrament to non-Catholics on the ground that since communion is an outward sign of an interior unity, by working the sign we might backwards affect the unity, reversing cause and effect, which is the precise definition of magic. And I'll take it a step further, Father, that these people, like for example Bergoglio would be one of them. He bragged about giving communion to Jews. They believe that if they give Holy Communion to Jews, it helps them to be more fervent in their own traditions.
And this is exactly what Amoris Laetitia is supposed to do. Put communion first and then the conversion afterwards. So he says at the bottom. Yep. So he says at the second paragraph on page 86, when a brilliant young lady asked the greatest scholar in the world at the close of the 4th century where she could get the best education, Saint Jerome replied, "You can't, because the world is through." And he advised her to enter a convent. Now he says down even further, the word monk derives from monos, meaning one, solitary, alone, as in monarch or monotony. A monk is essentially a man alone with God. When a few such gather together, the better to learn how to be alone, you have a convent, a coming together for convenience of persons in a monastery, a place of essential solitude. It was through the patient, silent witness of monks at prayer over the Dark Ages that what we call Christendom was achieved. Saint Benedict, patron of Europe, founded Monte Cassino in 529. Saint Thomas, as a little boy of 5, entered there to go to school around 1229. 700 years in the womb of Benedictine work and prayer, and then you have Saint Thomas. The seedbed of theology is the Benedictine life, without which no one has the prerequisites. Today we are, I think, in times like those of Saint Jerome, moving rapidly towards those of Saint Benedict. Barbarians have destroyed our cultural institutions, this time mostly from within. And now as then, it is true that there is nothing for the world to offer anyone. If I were a young man or woman seeking God today, I should enter, if I could, a Benedictine monastery. And if I were a Benedictine seeking God, I should work to reform my monastery so it conformed to the rule of St. Benedict in its strict integrity, praying 7 times a day the great Latin office as recovered by the painstaking sanctifying scholarship of Salem. And in the spaces between the hours, work with my hands at the immediate task of food and shelter. Or if I were called to the other vocations, the secular priesthood or marriage, I should become an oblate of such a monastery, or at least keep as close to it as I could, consistent with my obligations. If theology has become a superstition because the majority have lost the grounds of understanding, reform on a large scale is immediately impossible. In such a case, the thing to do is find the few extraordinary souls with special gifts of intellect and will, with a rational aptitude and zeal to learn, train them by an intensified Benedictine exercise, put them on to the daily resuscitation of the office, teach them the Summa Theologia as their daily work, and then send these elite soldiers of the mixed orders as the shock troops of a general Catholic counter-reformation. This is exactly what Prochadamus is about, supporting traditional religious life, the Oblates of St. Augustine. We need monasteries. We need monasteries, not necessarily of Mont Saint Michael up in France, but we need to help young men have the material temporal needs fulfilled, so that they don't have to actually get jobs, so that they could pray and study and do apostolate. Because we can't charge for prayer, we can't charge for study, we can't charge for doing apostolate. So the material, temporal things need to be met somehow. And so, in so much as the lay people fund monasteries and provide for their needs, then the monasteries are able to do the work that they need to restore society, to restore Christendom. So here we go.
Yeah, absolutely. In page 88, he basically talks through the chronicle of Saint Thomas' death and the Benedictines. Page 89, he says, when Saint Thomas was going to receive the Holy Viaticum, he said, "If in this world there be any knowledge of the sacrament stronger than that of faith, I wish now to use it in affirming that I firmly believe and know as certain that Jesus Christ, true God and true man, Son of God and Son of the Virgin Mary, is in this sacrament. I received thee, the price of my redemption, for whose love I have watched, studied, and labored. Thee have I preached, thee have I thought. Never have I said anything against thee. If anything was not well said, that is to be attributed to my ignorance. Neither do I wish to be obstinate in my opinions. But if I have written anything erroneous concerning the sacrament or other matters, I submit all to the judgment and correction of the Holy Roman Church. In its obedience, I now go, pass from this life." And then his final words, one spoken by the bride to Christ in the Song of Songs: "Let us go into the fields." And he says, of course, that St. Thomas did not die. He is alive and well, patiently waiting through those vigils of the night with everyone who prays the office of the church. Some of his own prayers are actually present there in several places, especially on the Feast of Corpus Christi. The Sacris Solemnis at Matins, with the famous stanza beginning Panis Angelicus, the O Salutaris Hostia at Lots, at Mass the sequence Laudación, and at Vespers the Pangelingua ending with Tantum Ergo Sacramentum, whose responsorium summarizes the sweetness of his love of Jesus, to whose presence in the Blessed Sacrament the words refer. We recall them not only from Vespers for Corpus Christi, but also from Benediction. Omne delectamentum in se aventem. So there we go. That's the chapter. Any further thoughts, Father?
I mean, there's no wonder why John Sr. had as some of his fruits those who entered Fomongo Abbey in France, who then later founded Clear Creek Monastery in Oklahoma, very much emphasizing and promoting the Benedictine way of life. Nevertheless, of course, that the religious life that preceded St. Benedict's rule, the rule of St. Benedict, was Augustinian, obviously, and St. Augustine very much had as root, I mean, the center, community life, prayer, study, all these same things. But for St. Augustine, obviously, there was an apostolic dimension to it, whereas the Benedictive life, there was really no apostolic work essential in in religious life, except for when the Pope called St. Augustine of Canterbury to go preach, St. Boniface, these places. But I also want to emphasize one thing that's also lacking in our culture, and Alberto, you and I have discussed this many times. St. Benedict was not a priest. St. Benedict was not a priest. When one enters a Benedictine abbey, Benedictine monastery, you enter to be a brother, not to be a priest. If the superiors choose you to become a priest, then you'll go off to studies and you'll become a priest. But it isn't like, hey, pick me. Yeah, I feel called to be a priest. Send me to seminary. And they'll look at you and say, no, sorry, not your choice. There's a habit that we have of thinking of a religious life or just a celibate vocation for a young man as primarily priesthood. And if somehow you don't have the intellectual faculties or whatever else, you can just be a brother. Just be a brother. Like, no one understands the significance of being consecrated in and of itself. So many people enter seminary to become a priest, and if they can't become a priest for one way or another, say, "Oh, I'm just going to go get married." Well, what about the whole celibacy aspect of your vocation? What about that whole calling? Because that's another calling in and of itself. If you were just going to be celibate because you wanted superpowers, then you really weren't celibate for love of God. You were celibate for a job, And so that's another thing that we have to change, even in the traditional world, the traditional movement, about thinking about vocations, is that celibacy actually means something to God and for us. So much so that his own Blessed Mother, he refused to violate her virginity, in the sense that she remained an ever virgin even after birth. It means so much to him. So it's not something light to just brush over and say, oh, you're a man and you don't why just be celibate? That makes no sense. Be a priest. It's a bizarre way of thinking.
Yes, absolutely. And in Benedictine monasteries, it's really very small minority that are priests. It's a major, as you mentioned, you don't go into a Benedictine into an abbey to be a priest. You go there to be consecrated to God. And then
Mhm.
if your superiors say, okay, we need somebody to get ordained a priest, and then they were to pick you. But I would think that if I was a Benedictine monk, I would not want to become a priest. Like, oh no, I have to dispense the sacraments.
Exactly.
But there's definitely that issue of, because we all hear it. Oh, my son is going to be. I want my son to be a priest, or whatever. Or do we raise our children to be saints? And then the logical conclusion from that is consecrated life.
Mm-hmm.
Through which it would seem to me that it's easier to be a saint being a Benedictine, just a brother, than being a diocesan priest. I mean, we know that, as a matter of fact, it really is. So,
yeah.
Anyway, that's everybody. Before we wrap up the show for tonight, remember to go to prochedamus.com and register, sign up, acquire a ticket for the Prochedamus 2026 Gala, Clearwater Beach, Florida. This gala is in support of the Old Roman Catholic See of Carglaw and the Oblates of St. Augustine. So if you're reading this and you're hearing, oh, the religious life and so on and so forth, how do I put how do I contribute to this? This is how. It's very, very simple, very straightforward. Contribute to prochedamus.com, Prochedamus Gala, attend, and then at the Gala, Father, we will also learn about more ways that we can support the Old Roman Catholic See of Carglaw, the Oblates of St. Augustine, in this restoration, because the work that you do, Father, the work of the Oblates, is directly for the restoration of Christian culture, not for the latest grifter's vacation to Europe or whatever. This is a direct contribution to the restoration of Christian culture, as we're learning here through John Senior. So anyway, anything else before we? Yes.
And for more information about our community, the Oblates of St. Augustine, you can go to www.oblatesofstaugustine.org.
There, and I will say, Father, that in oblatesofstaugustine.org, there are very, very convenient ways to donate to the Oblates. You can choose to do a weekly donation. Maybe if like, oh, I don't have money, or it seems to me difficult to give a monthly donation, like a lump sum. You can do a weekly donation. There's many ways, or just a one-time donation. There's a very, very flexible ways over in oblatesofstaugustine.org in which you can support the Oblates of St. Augustine and the mission, restoring Catholic, true traditional religious life. So anyway, Oblates to St. Anything else, Father, before we wrap up for tonight?
That's it. See you guys Friday for our Friday night leisure. See you in the chat. So see you guys on Friday. And then next week again for the next chapter in the restoration of Christian culture. God bless. Why Procedamus? I remember the day after my ordination, the morning of my first Mass, vesting in the sacristy, putting on the amice, putting on the alb, the cincture, the maniple, the stole, the vestments. I remember the 10 years that I had been preparing for this moment. Aside from the emotions and the nerves, I was aware of what offering the holy sacrifice of the Mass means for myself and for all the faithful. But additionally, given the context of the current persecution of the traditional Catholic faith in the world and in the Church, I grabbed my chalice, I grabbed my biretta, looked at the crucifix, bowed, and said, Procedamus in pacem, to which the altar servers replied, In nomine Christi, Amen. I put on my biretta, and we processed out to the altar to offer the holy sacrifice of the Mass, the traditional Latin Mass, the Mass of the ages. Ascending the steps of the altar, I felt only gratitude to our Lord for having allowed me to be an instrument in preserving that which is true, good, and beautiful for future generations, for the ages to come. As long as I'm physically able, this Mass will continue to be offered. This spirit of determination, this spirit of perseverance, is that to which I would love to invite all of you to share. The first annual Procedamus Gala is organized to support the mission of the Oblates of St. Augustine and the Old Roman Catholic See of Carglaw to preserve the traditional Latin Mass and the traditional Catholic faith for future generations. Procedamus.